I welcome all of you on behalf of the Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement. I welcome you all to the International Young Scholars Summit 2020. I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished chair for the session, Dr. Shampa Kundu, fellow scholars and participants who have joined us through Zoom and are watching us live on Facebook. We are glad to witness your presence today. This international forum aims to bring together rigorous and erudite young scholars from all around the world over a single platform. The aim is to create an academic space to encourage young scholars and academicians from the field of international relations, political science, diplomacy, policy, administration, and related subfields. The conference will be held for 3 days consecutively and will have 30 different sessions with 2 sessions running parallelly throughout in white and green rooms. The conference will feature 275 scholars from 25 different countries who will be delivering their presentations and sharing their understanding on various topics with us. The session is streaming live on our Facebook, so please feel free to share it on your social media handle with hashtag IYSS2020. This is the 18th session of the conference. To chair and moderate this session, it is a real pleasure to have with us Dr. Shampa Kundu. Dr. Kundu is an assistant professor at the Amity Institute for Social Sciences, Amity University, Noida. Previously, she worked with Delhi-based MP Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis and Pune-based Symbiosis International deemed university. She has more than 4 years of research and 2 years of teaching experience. She completed her PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi on India and Myanmar in BIMSTEC, implications for Northeast India. Her area of specialization includes Southeast Asian geopolitics and India relations with Southeast Asia. Without much further ado, I may ask Ms. Dr. Sampa Kundu to follow. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Rafia. Thank you for that very nice introduction. So I welcome all the speakers to this 18th session of International Young Scholar Summit 2020 organized by NICE Nepal. So in the beginning, I would like to thank NICE Nepal for organizing such a nice webinar with 275 young scholars. So that's a really very great initiative. So without wasting much of time, because I think we have 8 or 9 participants for this panel discussion. So without wasting much time, I would like to first invite Mr. Siddhant Sharma, who is a research scholar at Amity University. And Siddhant will be speaking on Indo-Australian comparative analysis of different soft power mechanisms, particularly focusing on educational, cultural, and diplomatic aspects. So over to you, Siddhant.
Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. So this is Siddhant. My topic for presentation is Indo-Australian comparative analysis of different soft power mechanisms. I'll be sharing my screen. Uh, is it visible?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay. So while focusing on the Indo-Australian affairs, we first need to understand the historical background of the bilateral relationship. The Indo-Australian affairs are particularly determined by several complex administrative, diplomatic, as well as bilateral mechanisms by different interactions happening at different levels. These levels involve government, business, and the basic level is people-to-people interaction. These interactions are really crucial in determining the nature of different hard power as well as soft power mechanisms. In order to understand the basic of hard power as well as soft power mechanisms, we first need to understand that hard power mechanisms involve economic as well as military strength, while the soft power mechanisms involve educational, cultural, and diplomatic strategies. The Indo-Australian Partnership has been identified as a comprehensive strategic partnership model, sharing historical relations, being under the administrative supremacy of British Empire. They both share a rich historical background, and the contemporary relationship that both countries have is determined by a complex web of diplomatic as well as informal negotiations. There have been several efforts from the Indian side to scale up the partnership, considering the recent challenges that we are facing from COVID and the Chinese influence in Indo-Pacific region. Australia has always remained an attractive destination for Indians, which also acts as a promotional factor for the government to scale up the relationship collaboratively, increasing bilateral coherence. Well, in in order to scale up the partnership, there is a model for bilateral engagement that has to be followed at every scale, whether it's trade or it's economic or it's military strategy. The first strategy has to be referred that there has to be people-to-people interaction uh, uh, from both the countries, and then followed by business-to-business interaction. When there will be people-to-people interaction, it will be directly followed by businesses following the interaction happening with people. These both the interactions have to be supported at a level of government to by both the state governments, and it can, so therefore we can increase the bilateral partnership among both the nations. So while focusing on business to business interactions, the trade relations between India and Australia dates back to 18th and 19th centuries, with imports and exports happening across the nations. So it is not it is not a contemporary relationship, but there is a historical background there also, that we see the relationship from 18th and 19th century, that there is a huge export from both the nations. Trade has remained a significant determinant in characterizing diplomatic relations across the world. And for the focus of India-Australia relationship is that there is a huge people interaction in the term of whether Indians going to Australia to study or to gain job opportunities in different aspects. The business relations have improved considerably, promoting the interconnection of people across the nations. It has also enhanced the soft power influencing capabilities of both the nations. This is the point that I was discussing. It is the people-to-people interaction, which is the base of every soft power mechanism. If there is no people-to-people interaction across between two nations, then there is no base of bilateral relationship. Another major determinant of bilateral relations remain the nature of interaction that happen in the form of cultural exchange. Australia has always remained one of the attractive destinations for students from India, which provides it as the soft power influence and diplomatic edge over bilateral relationship of the nations. Further, Australia remains one of the attractive destinations for tourists from India, providing a strong boost for bilateral relations for both the nations. Now, how this is characterized as a soft power boost? There are certain things that can be replicated in the administrative system of India, and the administrative framework of India can be enhanced with the help of learning from these soft power mechanisms. So Australia boasts of its soft power strengths, such as its democratic society to multicultural society, as well as showcasing its strong economy, lavish lifestyle, and global institutions. There was a white paper which was introduced by government of Australia in 2017, which boasted of its digital diplomacy. The same model can be replicated to suit Indian needs and to its population. The digital approach of integration adopted in the administrative mechanisms in Australia is further emerges as a game changer in the arena of international politics. The interconnectedness offered by the digital infrastructure has facilitated the regional infrastructure across the nation. This similar approach, that the different digital institutions, digital diplomacy, and digital interactions, uh, particularly in the post-COVID world and the challenge that we have, it can be enhanced and replicated in Indian administrative framework. The concept of digital integration and digital diplomacy has the potential of transforming the bilateral landscape of negotiations and diplomacy. It also has the potential to integrate different soft power mechanisms to promote the interests of both the nations as per their necessities. So, the first major issue, the major issue that we are covering here is that the impact of COVID on both the bilateral relations in terms of soft power mechanisms as well as hard power mechanisms. COVID pandemic has transformed the existing political, economic, and social relations globally and has had a significant impact on bilateral relations of numerous changes. Uh, while the conspiracy theories alleging that China it is the act of bioterrorism have only raised international suspicion and which can prove as an opportunity for Indo-Australian relationship and as well as the Indian-Australian relationship has also witnessed a major hit during the pandemic because several universities have gone completely virtual and students have returned to India, having an impact on both the nations. The interactions among the people of both the nations have stalled, resulting in a break of bilateral diplomatic partnership. Further, several opportunities have also sprouted up to the scale to engagement process and to diplomatically engage both the nations in an integrated manner. The virtual summit organized in June 2020 between both the Prime Minister has also resulted in the formation of new Indo-Pacific engagement for both the nations. These opportunities must be utilized, which which have the potential of bringing economic, political, and social benefits to both the nations, utilizing the different soft power mechanisms. And finally, what we see the future of soft power mechanism, particularly in the post-COVID world, the soft power mechanisms have the potential to transform the Indo-Australian bilateral engagement, significantly involving the participation of several international as well as domestic actors. Although the COVID situation has created several challenges for the world, it has also initiated the route of new opportunities to drive out the flaws of the system and to increase the efficiency of the global framework. So in this statement that it is a very crucial statement in determining the bilateral relationship, we have to first focus on the challenges that COVID situation has brought, but it has also brought new opportunities. We can, which provides us the opportunity to drive out the flaws of the system and to increase the efficiency of the global framework. The different soft power mechanisms have a major role to enhance bilateral cooperation and promote the interest of both the nations. I would like to conclude my presentation on this point. Thanking you, thanks everyone for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddhant. I think you have covered quite a lot of issues in your presentation, starting from the differences between hard power and soft power. Then you moved on to talk about business to business relationship, people to people contact. You have also spoken about the defense white paper and why Indo-Pacific is important for Australia. And you also spoke about the digital diplomacy. So it was a comprehensive presentation. Thank you. I do have few questions for you, but I think I should reserve them for the end of the session. So now I
Sure.
would like to invite Ms. Arpita Singh, research scholar at Amity University. And Arpita will be speaking on COVID-19 and women leaders in Indo-Pacific. So over to you, Arpita.
Yes, ma'am. I'm just uploading my PPT. And there's some problem and I'm unable to upload the document.
Have you shared your presentation with the organizers? In that case, we can request.
What you can do is if you have not shared the presentation, kindly mail it to us. I'll mention the email ID in the chat box and you can send it to us. We can have you as the next speaker. Till then,
Yes,
we can.
okay, all right. Okay. Thank you so much.
So in that case, okay. So thank you, Pakhi. So in that case, we can have Dipankar De now. Dipankar is a student from University of Calcutta, and Dipankar will be talking about challenges to trade and security in the Indo-Pacific region. So Dipankar.
Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can I start, ma'am?
Yes,
My presentation.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon. Respected chairperson and all the scholars who are joining these sessions. Challenges to trade and security in the Indo-Pacific region. West everybody, let's start. With the turn of the new decades, the global
Sorry
politics.
for the interruption, Dipankar. There is some background noise coming from your end. Can you please check that? Some disturbance is
Sorry, ma'am. One minute, ma'am. Just now it is clear, ma'am.
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody present here, respected chairpersons, and all the scholars who are joining these sessions. Today, my topic of discussion is challenges to trade and security in the Indo-Pacific region. Don't wasting time, let's start. With the turn of the new decades, global politics has also witnessed dramatic shift, so much so that the scholars shared huge energy on the despairing the nature of the changing world order in almost every region of the world. Most analysis result from the assumptions that the Indo-Pacific is an objective description of the maritime region in China is rising. One of the principal assumptions of many Western theorists is that if China continue to rise economically, then it will inevitably increase the size of its military expenditure, which in turn will threaten the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Therefore, the Trump's administration has constructed the term Indo-Pacific in the geopolitics sense, which serve the economic, military, and the national interest of the US, thus fulfill Trump's American First promises. Although US and its alliance partners has not fundamentally changed with China's inexorable economic rise. From the Chinese perspective, China has considered herself as a superpower since the past 2000 years. But China has also faced the humiliations for someone, such as Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 and the Opium War and so on. The questioning of the term Indo-Pacific by the foreign policy makers in the United States of America naturally gives importance to the India in this region. At this juncture, it is necessary to summarize the reason behind the formations of the new order in Indo-Pacific region as seen from the Anglophile perspective. First, the rise of China as a global power. Second, that India's growth in economic and strategic sector. Third, the importance of Indian Ocean as a maritime route of trade. Fourth, the role of middle powers in the region like Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea, and Singapore. The term Indo-Pacific is interpreted differently by the different stakeholders. India looks at this region as an inclusive, open, integrated area. Indian foreign policy has focused on interconnecting the common challenges and opportunities that nation is in this region face. The US considered the region to be a very free and open area, highlighting the importance of rule of norms conduct in this region. Apart from this, ASEAN countries look at Indo-Pacific as a consolidational model, since the four biggest economies in this region are USA, China, India, and Japan. Trade relations are important for the region. Countries such as Australia and Indonesia are also important players. More than 14% of global seaborne trade passes through the Strait of Malacca. 15.5 million barrels of oil trade passes through the Gulf of Hormuz, and 11 million barrels of oil trade is conducted through the Malacca and the Singapore Strait. In the postmodern capitalism have created an avert tensions between the specific nation state, a rules-based trading regime, and the security that emerge as important in this region. Being a driving force, China has been expanding her naval power in the South China Sea as well as the Indian Oceans, and increasing militarizations of the Indo-Pacific has also faced smaller power within the region to pick sides between two dominant forces of China, and the primary security challenges faced in the sea lane of communications. To meet these security challenges, the regional power in the Indo-Pacific region have made trilateral partnerships between India, Japan, and the USA. The Malabar naval exercise in the case in the point important initiatives taken by the state actors in this region are then the Trans-Pacific Partnerships, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnerships, One Belt One Road initiatives, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank on the part of China. India's act, its policy, and so on. What is the India's role in the Indo-Pacific region? India has been playing a major role in the Indo-Pacific region in the recent years. So India does not go any confrontations, but is pursuing her strategic interest in this region. First, India support the rule-based order for a stable trade environment in the Indo-Pacific region to foster the trade ties. Second, India always want a unified ASEAN for growth and prosperity. Third, India does not agree fully with the US proposals of rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific region that seeks to counter Chinese dominance. Scholars describe it as hedging, while a recent paper used the term evasive balancing to explain the Indian foreign policy behavior in the region, because India tries to engage in the balancing while trying to reassure China for not engaging in the sorry, balancing act. Thus, what is seen in the Pax Sinica in this region manifests itself as a China's debt trap diplomacy, according to critics. Every nation in this region must obey international law, which is ensure the equal access of space and the sea for exercise of sovereign powers. Maritime domain awareness is necessary for security in the Indo-Pacific region. India had taken the initiative for implementing a strategy, namely SAGAR, security and growth for all the region. By these measures, whether the Indo-Pacific region will move on to the multipolar world order, or world would be side a great rivalry remain to be seen. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Nice, for providing me with this opportunity to present my ideas. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Dipankar. It was really nice and comprehensive presentation. You have touched upon many points, including Donald Trump administration and the changes that we can see in US foreign policy uh, in the recent years. And then you have also spoken about the geopolitical tension between United States of America and China. You have spoken about Indian foreign policy and what is the importance of Indo-Pacific region in India's foreign policy. So thank you, Dipankar. It was a good presentation. So can we have Arpita's presentation now?
Yes, ma'am. I request you to share my PPT.
All right. So when the NICE team is uploading the PPT shared by Arpita, I would like to introduce Arpita. Arpita is a scholar at the Amity University, Amity Institute of Social Sciences, and she will be talking on COVID-19 and women leaders in the Indo-Pacific. So Arpita, by that time, why don't you just start your presentation?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. A very good afternoon to all. First of all, I would like to thank Sompa ma'am and the team of NICE for giving me this wonderful platform. I'm really happy and honored to be part of this. So my topic of presentation is COVID-19 and women leaders in Indo-Pacific region. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you're perfectly audible, Arpita.
Thank you so much. Coronavirus disease 2019 is defined as illness caused by a novel coronavirus, now called severe acute respiratory syndrome. The first case of coronavirus pandemic 2019-20 was reported in India on January 30, 2020. In these 7 months' time, India has reported over 4.2 million coronavirus cases, along with approximately 71,642 deaths, with most affected countries of Italy, Spain, US, and China, the epicenter of coronavirus pandemic. The disparity in the socioeconomic status of men and women is already an impediment for women's advancement and empowerment, and the particular pandemic has increased the load on women in particular. Domestic and care work burden. A lockdown increases the burden of household work for all families. Children are off from school. They have to be homeschooled, fed, and entertained. The elderly are at risk and have to be attended to with greater care than usual. This whole apparatus is now disrupted, as homes with part-time help are confronted with increased housework because the service providers are in lockdown too. While both men and women are stranded at home, which of the two is dealing with this avalanche of domestic chores and care work disproportionately? In principle, both. In practice, it's the women, regardless of whether they hold a job or not. If they do, then they double the burden of domestic chores and their day jobs is now multiplied many times over, because their day job is now has a new name, which is work from home. Impact of pandemic management on women. The most horrific and obvious impact of the lockdown, imposed to flatten the curve, has been a rise in domestic and intimate partner violence, as has been noted for US, UK, China, among other countries. A rise in domestic violence literally increases the risk of women's life. One of the big myths about domestic violence is that it is greater among poorer sections. The reality is that rich and middle class women are not immune to it. In India, because this is seen as essentially a problem of the poor, it is not very high on policy priorities. Given the class bias in policy making, helplines, shelters, legal assistance for battered women are woefully inadequate at the best of times. It is incredibly hard for women to speak up openly even under the most supportive conditions. Economic impact. Impact of COVID-19 suggests that women's economic and productive lives will be affected disproportionately and differently from men. The situation is worse in developing economies where the vast majority of women's employment, 70%, constitute in the informal economy with few protections against dismissal or for paid sick leave and limited access to social protection. The Ebola virus showed that the quarantine can significantly reduce women's economic and livelihood activities, increasing poverty rates and exacerbating food insecurity. From past experiences and emerging data, it is possible to project that the impact of COVID-19 global recession will result in prolonged dip in women's income and labor force participation, with compounded impacts for women already living in poverty. Some of the important examples from the leaders of Indo-Pacific region are India. The women of India are writing the positive story of COVID-19. Well, this is a story of women self-help group, that is SHGs, who have actively joined the hands of government in managing, handling, spreading awareness, and mitigating the COVID-19 crisis in India. They are involved in the making of masks and hand sanitizers, manufacturing of personal protective equipment, that is PPE, and are also engaged in functioning of community kitchens and ensuring delivery of food to the deprived section. Jivika, a woman SHG based in Bihar, have been working tirelessly to create awareness among people about the personal hygiene necessary to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The need to maintain social distancing has also been advocated by Jivika. A situation like COVID-19 pandemic, however, proves that women are the pillars of Indian society, and women empowerment should be the priority of our socio-political and economic systems and structures. New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, with many countries reeling from COVID-19 pandemic, New Zealand is proving a model of recovery and is lifting part of its strict lockdown. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has applied her trademark empathy to rally her country of 5 million to attempt what few states have tried, that is, to eradicate, not just mitigate, the novel coronavirus. Testing widely, relying on science, strong leadership, getting hard, and going early are some of the important actions taken by New Zealand. Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, despite its proximity to China, where the outbreak first appeared, Taiwan has turned out to be a model in COVID-19 pandemic. Taiwan responded quickly to the outbreak and appears to have limited spread. Its government leveraged technology to trace and quarantine sick people, upped its mass production, and trained communities for lockdown through large-scale simulations. What significantly aided Taiwan's response was digitization of healthcare records of its citizens. Health officials harnessed this data to send alerts to doctors about patients at higher risk of COVID-19 based on their travel history. Taiwan has one of the world's top healthcare system, strong research capabilities, and transparent information. Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, despite being one of the densely populated countries, Bangladesh has a low coronavirus death rate so far. Bangladesh has a death rate of 1.3%, one of the world's lowest, against the global average of 3.54%. The foremost step that Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina took was to diffuse the panic among the citizens. She conducted national broadcast with frontline workers almost every day and avoided using the word lockdown in any of its references. Through this graph, we can see that the countries in Indo-Pacific region, women leaders at the helm seem to have handled the coronavirus pandemic significantly better than their male counterparts. Study published in the Center of Economic Policy Research and the Economic Forum, and it analyzed 194 countries hit by COVID-19. However, since only 19 countries had women leaders. To conclude, I would like to say that in Indo-Pacific, women account for only 18% of parliamentarians, owing in large part to patriarchal social norms that regard women as unsuitable for public life decision-making process and positions. The perpetuation of these gender stereotypes in addressing the COVID-19 challenges has yielded significant consequence for our societies. Ignoring the vital role played by women in leading the COVID-19 response could see us miss the opportunity to take constructive and impactful actions to set us on the road to recovery. In order to respond effectively to COVID-19 destruction, women need to be at the front line. We need to learn from our wartime experiences that increased engagement by women strengthens society as a whole and can contribute to stronger societies that they were before. With the epidemic posing global challenge for all of us, promoting the leadership of women now is likely to achieve global successes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arpita.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sorry,
So,
ma'am, to interrupt you. Sorry, ma'am, just a second. I'm very sorry for interrupting. But just a request to all the panelists, if you are requesting us to share the presentations, please inform us whenever to change the slides, because we haven't seen your presentations before and we need to know what are you speaking and how do we have to change the slides. So just say next or something so that we change. Thank you. Sorry.
no, it's okay. I understand. So, Arpita, that presentation was really interesting because you have spoken about the positive aspect of COVID-19 when the whole world is actually, talking about the negative aspects, the negative impact. I really liked when you said that the women need to be on the front line. So I think we have enough and substantial data to show that yes, women can be, pioneers in many cases, including the fight against a pandemic like COVID-19. So thank you, Arpita, for that excellent presentation.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Now I would like to request Abhoday. Abhoday is a student at University of Delhi, and he will be talking about Indo-Pacific, the new theater, and the case for the Middle Powers Coalition. So again, another very interesting topic. Over to you, Abhoday.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to thank Nish, first of all, for providing me this platform. And with this, I'll begin. So my topic at hand is Indo-Pacific, the new theater, and the case for Middle Power Coalition. The historical dominance of Western power ebbs away in the face of Asian resurgence, with the analysts and academicians contemplating the Asian century. And at the center of this transformation is the Indo-Pacific. However, there is a lot at stake here. What the apologists for the Asian century forget is that there is no monolithic worldview among the Asian powers. Although the rise of Asia has undoubtedly brought advancements in the development and prosperity of the region, it remains home to a wide range of potential conflicts and other sources of instability.
analysts have for long been divided regarding the process of power transformation and its implications for the Indo-Pacific region. Remember the beginning of the century, when people were looking towards 2020 hopefully with all the sorts of expectations. Yet here we are in 2020 with all sorts of problems and a pandemic at hand. The pandemic had transformed even the doors to be hawkish on the question of stability in Indo-Pacific and the peaceful rise of China. China is becoming more and more involved in creating its sphere of influence at the cost of USA's alliance system. To stall any confrontation, the USA has been retreating and ceding space for quite a long time. The pandemic has catalyzed the process of the crumbling of liberal international world order. The overall situation looks pretty grim. Let's look into the Indo-Pacific as theater of conflict and understand the concept of middle power coalition. Indo-Pacific, the 21st century theater of conflict. The Indian Ocean connects the world's most vital sea lanes of trade, commerce, and communication, feeding the Asia's economic multivariant needs. Around 80% of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through the choke points of this ocean, and therefore it connects the east to the west. Although the region was always of high value and importance, the rise of Asian economies in 21st century has directly impacted the exponential increase in valuation of the Indo-Pacific. As per Commander S.S. Parmar, the geopolitical significance of Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean stems from the fact that it is the centerpiece in the wider Indian Ocean region. The combination of economic growth and slowdown, military expansion, increasing demand for natural resources, and demographic combined with geopolitical situations has increased the significance of this area. The stakes are so high that this is in the best interest of the world that the status quo is maintained. The international waters remain open for all, and any action or effort to the contrary be criticized into retreat. The USA-led alliance system finds itself with the USA not in a mood to lead anymore. And then there is China, which does not want to follow any international norms where it has to compromise even an inch. Most probably, moving ahead, the USA's foreign policy doctrine will be similar to a sine curve, oscillating between isolationism and internationalism. China is trying to play the geopolitical Russian roulette as it thinks it has found the rhythm of USA's foreign policy. Beijing thinks of the COVID-19 pandemic to be a small window of opportunity when if it can successfully create its sphere of influence and become a power which cannot be messed with and will be able to sustain the backlash which is expected to arrive after the pandemic is over. Thus, it is aggressively pursuing its objectives and accomplishing them as well. However, other countries are not just going to roll out the red carpet and let Beijing have its way. The Middle Power Coalition. The Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific is also home to a range of secondary powers that not only have stakes in the evolving regional order, but also significant capabilities to respond to and potentially shape their strategic environment. These states are frequently referred to as middle powers. And while they do not possess the full range of power resources at the disposal of world's handful of truly great powers, they can be distinguished from the majority of small or minor powers who lack any capacity to meaningfully influence the international system. As Adam Balcer predicted in 2012, in the coming decades, the role of middle powers in international arena is most probably going to increase substantially. With the current situation of downward spiral of things going from bad to worse, the countries that find themselves to be the most vulnerable are these middle power countries. The current undeclared Cold War situation between USA and China is certainly an opportunity for these newly emerging middle powers to work for their interest by engaging in mediation as an alternate voice in coalition building assisting in managing the international system, and contributing to global governance in the age of renewed great power rivalry. The middle powers, as defined by scholars, does not include much of big and great powers, who will be affected and are very much interested in maintaining the status quo and the liberal international order. Thus, the way forward would be to create a minimum operational understanding among middle powers in Indo-Pacific and big powers minus USA and China. This would create a coalition of such scale and clout that they would be able to manage the situation and contain the great power rivalry with minimal effect. It would be the best route in the face of current health of the world. The world cannot take any more proliferation of catastrophic escalations. Humankind will not be able to absorb more shocks peacefully. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Abhoday. I think you have touched upon a very important aspect of the Indo-Pacific, that is the role of the middle powers. Coincidentally, I was reading an article which is published very recently in September 2020 by Italian Journal of Foreign Affairs or International Affairs. And this particular article is about alignment cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So I think you can take a lot of help from this article if you are working on this particular subject. I do have a few questions for you, but let us preserve those questions for the end of the session. So now the next speaker would be Kavya Chaurasia. Kavya is a student from Benares Hindu University, and Kavya will be speaking about India experimenting equipoise in the Indo-Pacific. So over to you, Kavya.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. This is Kavya from Banaras Hindu University, and I will be presenting on the topic India experimenting equipoise in the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific as a geopolitical concept hasn't been new. Rather, its origin could be traced back to 1920s when Karl Fischer coined it for the first time. Since then, the term has been subjected to has been tossed into several meanings, subjected to the national interest of different states. Although in recent time, the term has seen a momentum as the world is facing heat of a new Cold War. This Cold War, unlike the previous one, is neither stationed in Europe nor on the territorial spheres. Rather, there has been a shift towards Asia, specifically speaking South and Southeast Asia, and towards Indo-Pacific, where one superpower is stationed at the Pacific coast, that is USA, and the other has a proximity to the Indian Ocean, that is China. This location of the two strategic superpowers at two ends make the term Indo-Pacific more relevant now today. Moving towards India's role in this Indo-Pacific, there have been two dominant reasons that provides a predominant position to the country in the Indo-Pacific. The first reason is India's territorial position, that is, it has almost a 7,000-kilometer coastline in the Indian Ocean, and that has a centrality in the Indian Ocean, as well as a territorial boundary that it shares with China. This provides a significant location to the country that's important for the Indo-Pacific strategies. The reterming of the term Asia-Pacific to that of Indo-Pacific is evident enough to prove that what role does India plays in this changing scenario. The second reason that provides impetus to the country is the inclination of USA towards India, seeking it as a major defense partner. That was even highlighted in the US's Department of Defense recent Indo-Pacific strategy report, which seeked India as a major defense partner. So it's important now to acknowledge what does India really feel about Indo-Pacific as a reason. India in the Shangri-La Dialogue 2018 highlighted its version of Indo-Pacific that extended from the horns of Africa to that of America. For the first time, world saw such a broad definition of Indo-Pacific, and that was based on the vision of free and open Indo-Pacific, that is open, stable, secure, and that is based on the consent of all and not power of few. If we see policy-wise, what does India is doing to deal with this changing dynamics, the policy could be, I would be attributing it as more of an experimenting equipoise. I would say it as an experimentation because it is something that India is trying differently from what it tried in the previous Cold War. In the previous Cold War, India aimed for non-alignment. Now India has made a strategic shift from the idea of non-alignment that's moving towards new techniques. A recent remark of Minister of External Affairs of India, Mr. S. Jaishankar, would make it more clear, who said that the non-alignment has been an idea of a bygone era, and but that doesn't mean rushing towards alignments. India has never been part of an alliance system, nor will it ever be. All this taken together signals towards something like of an equipoise in the region. Equipoise, I would say, is a state of equilibrium that refuses to join any alliances but is based on multilateral indulgences that is guided by the idea of a strategic autonomy. This equipoise India is aiming through a fourfold synergy. The first aspect of this synergy is the decisive shift towards West. By West here I mean the Western countries like USA, Japan, Australia, who often form an informal strategic or security collaboration in the Indo-Pacific, often seen as an Asian NATO, that is aiming to counter or contain the movement of China in the Indo-Pacific. It is very obvious for India in coming times to face certain coercive pushes from China, as China is a rising superpower. And no rising superpower would ever love to have another rising superpower in its backyard. So it's important that India is going to face certain coercive pushes that India is facing even now in the coming time. So it's important to have West as a front to balance the Chinese strategies. The second point in this fourfold synergy could be the non-West fronts. Now, one thing important here to note that these are non-West fronts and not anti-West fronts. Means they do not involve Western countries, but they aren't working directly against the Western countries. They have their own agendas to work on. The groupings like Russia, India, China cooperation, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, etc. All these cooperations that are aiming more to work together in this region. This is strategically important for India because it provides a balance between West and the East. It provides a scapegoat to the country from allegations that it has fallen into the Western alliances. So it's basically a balance between Western and Eastern, and not just a balance. It provides a formal diplomatic stage for the country to resolve conflicts with countries like China or Russia that may occur in future times. The third point in this fourfold synergy is the string of pearls strategy of China. It's evident that China is trying this string of pearls in the Indian Ocean to contain the movement of India in the Indian Ocean itself. India has also aimed something similar through a port-based investment in the region. In the investment in the ports like the Changi Naval Base, Singapore, the Sabang Port in Indonesia, the Assumption Islands in Seychelles, the Duqm Port in the Oman, or the Chabahar Port in Iran. If seen closely, this forms a string in the Indo-Pacific, or I would say, that is similar to that of the string of pearls strategy of China. Also, this provides India the strategic position over the busiest choke points of the world that are like the Strait of Maldives, the Strait of Hormuz, or the Malacca Strait. So this becomes an important point in India's strategy. The last point in this fourfold synergy is the Look East policy of India. India has been practicing this Look East policy successfully for decades and is planning to continue such policy. Indulging with Eastern countries, basically with economic and cultural cooperation that act as a gateway to the Pacific, is important, as they enjoy a strategic position in the Indo-Pacific. Also, these associations do have a latent potential to turn strategic or military as and when needed. So it's important to have a good relation with these Eastern countries. Conclusively, I would say that India hasn't put all its egg in a single basket and is rather weighing all parameters to gain maximum out of this changing flux. But I would say that India should continue its multilateral indulgences. Where the world is moving away from multilateralism, India is pushing towards multilateralism. This is important. And multilateralism that should be based or guided by the idea of strategic autonomy. But then India should see that it's not just a balancer between two superpowers. Rather, it should have a role that is much more than a balancer and move towards an indulgences with the new non-traditional powers that are emerging in the region. These indulgences should be based on the issue-based collaborations that make India a more strategic player in this changing global scenario and not just a balancer in it. So thank you for all listening me so patiently, and this is all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavya. Your conclusion was really interesting, as you rightly pointed out that India should not, engage itself only as a balancer, but it should follow the mandate of its own foreign policy, which includes strategic autonomy and a lot of other issues. So that's a very good point. You spoke about India's locust policy. You spoke about India's geostrategic location in the Indo-Pacific. You touched upon the issue of minilateralism, trilateralism. So overall, it was a very good and comprehensive presentation. Uh, so now
Thank you.
I would like to request the next presenter, who is from Center for Air Power Studies, New Delhi, Rushali Shaha, and she will be talking about balancing or bandwagoning, rethinking India's Indo-Pacific strategy. So over to you, Rushali.
Thank you so much for the recognition, Chair. It's great to be back. I had the honor of sharing a panel with you, ma'am. And it's always great to be a part of a nice initiative. And I would like to congratulate the team for the very smooth transition to webinars, which they've done in this era of COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the advantages of being one of the last speakers is that the stage is quite nicely set and the geopolitics of the region has come out quite well. In many ways, my paper actually does, Kavya has thematically covered most of what my paper wanted to say, and in many ways it complements it. So I'll get right to the topic. Now, at the very outset, I'd like to clarify one thing is that in my title, although I have used the terms balancing and bandwagoning, I believe that the most appropriate term to define India's Indo-Pacific strategy or Indo-Pacific approach more specifically is evasive balancing, which was also previously mentioned by one of our speakers. Now, this is a term which actually Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan came up with, and he has elaborated on it in an article in the International Affairs. Now, I believe that evasive balancing is probably the most appropriate term when it comes to India's Indo-Pacific approach. And with recent geopolitical developments which have been elaborated upon by my fellow speakers, I think it is more true than ever before. One strong thing which I believe in is that the Indo-China border clashes, the impact, the reverberations of that will be felt in the Indo-Pacific region. And this is quite evident already. Just look at how the militarization may not be the right word, but the increased military activity in the region is taking place. So there have been joint naval drills between India and United States, between India and Japan, and a trilateral exercise between United States, Australia, Japan, and the Philippine Sea. We've also seen US is coming up with its RIMPAC exercise soon this year, and it is inviting even more players this time. This has to be understood in context of US's largely confrontational approach towards China. Whether we look at policy statements, whether we look at official statements, whether we just hear Mike Pompeo speak, it is clear that that United States is now ready, and it wants to rather, I'd say, confront China, and it's building a narrative that China's rise is very disruptive to the rules-based order in the region. So the most significant development, I believe, is that USA's stand on the South China Sea, where that is a mammoth shift from its previous policy posture. So now we see that it has a much stronger voice, and it is sort of reaffirming its commitment to this region. So this is, I believe, the immediate backdrop for the collective action which is unfolding in the region, and there is no doubt that these are because of Chinese aggressive behavior. What do I mean by Chinese aggressive behavior? I'm looking at just the post-pandemic period. Let me cite some examples for you. Of course, we have the border conflict with India. We have confrontation with Vietnam in South China Sea. There have been attempts by China to dilute Hong Kong's autonomous status. China has threatened Australia with the boycott of wine, barley, and beef, all of which are quite essential to Australian economy. And of course, relations with the United States are rapidly deteriorating, and a blame game which is going on. Meanwhile, one thing has happened is that the Galwan standoff has solidified an opinion in India that we need to change our China policy. This is very shocking because it is coming from some of the people in the diplomatic establishments who have strongly held that a cooperative approach towards China is the way forward, given that it's the rise of Asia, given that both of us are Asian giants, and that together we'll be able to achieve great heights. So these diplomatic authorities are now coming up and saying that no, it is time to confront China. So we see an scholarly as well as within the policy circles, this unanimous consensus that we need to be more openly confrontational towards China. And it is my belief that Indo-Pacific is this one avenue which allows us to do that. Now, I am saying keeping in mind that even the de-escalation talks which are taking place with China have largely failed. Economically, you see we're leveraging our huge market by restricting Chinese businesses. But on the diplomatic front, we're still maintaining a certain amount of ambiguity when it comes to dealing with China. So some moves have definitely been positive during this time, where we see that India moved quite swiftly to elevate its partnership with Australia, and it also unveiled a shared vision for maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Ties with the United States are arguably the best than they've ever been. And this has led many in the US to believe that India will join its camp. Now, as Kavya has already pointed out, this is not true, because our External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has repeatedly said that India will not join any camps. And just to be clear, I am not advocating India giving up its strategic autonomy to balance against China, because as has also been pointed out, the key to our Indo-Pacific vision, or the nuanced Indo-Pacific vision, is that it's inclusive. Yet we are not clear whether this vision is inclusive towards China or not. And this is what I'd like to point out. Like, a China which is inclusive in our order is not a threat to India only, but it is a threat to all the countries in the region because of its confrontational approach. So this also explains partially why India is so hesitant to involve Australia into the Malabar exercises. New Delhi's vision with Washington, it coincides, whether you look at ideas such as freedom of navigation, whether you look at rule of law, whether you look at freedom from coercion, whether you look at respect for sovereignty, whether you look at private enterprises and open markets, all these areas there is a conversion of interests. Yet our Indo-Pacific vision does not coincide with that of the United States. In fact, we have gone more ahead than any other country to separate Indo-Pacific from Quad. Now, there's a lot of talk, of course, of the militarization of Quad and openly confrontational Quad against China. But even those expectations have to be tempered, because I personally don't see the militarization of Quad as a very as a prospect from the Indian side, given the policy pronouncement and given Jaishankar's repeated assurance that it is not against any one country. The most significant thing I think here is the involvement of Russia, where India has recently invited Russia to be a part of the Indo-Pacific construct, which is actually an extension of its approach from much before. India has constantly been trying to get Russia involved in the region, and this will definitely go against what United States wants. So there is a possibility how India will handle both countries, which is the balancing part of it, with Russia as well as the United States in the same construct, is something which is definitely worth seeing, and it is quite exciting to see how that would unfold. But I would go back again now to Professor Rajagopalan, who actually argues that this evasive balancing is not viable. He authoritatively points out that what we're doing is, although experimental, as has been pointed out, but it is not a suitable strategy for the long run, because we have to face China now. It is more clear than ever that Chinese ambitions are off the roof, and they are trying to change the rules-based order. So in such a context, the question which I would like to raise, which I would love to discuss with my fellow panelists, is this strategy viable? In my opinion, it's not. In my opinion, we need to be more assertive in the Indo-Pacific. We have built our multiple partnerships. And by assertive, I do not mean hegemonic, I do not mean dominance, but I mean building stronger partnerships with countries which will help us promote the shared values on which we are basing this region. And we have to remember that strained Sino-Indian relations, of course, have provided a very strong opening for stronger ties with the United States. And I think that this is a crucial opportunity for us to strengthen those ties and make it clear to the Chinese and to the world that we are a global superpower, so that we are a global power, and that we will not be a passive recipient of the order which is building in the Indo-Pacific, but we will build it ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roshali. That was a really good presentation. I really liked it. There are a lot of things that we have learned from your presentation, starting from the way you focused on India's hesitation on Indo-Pacific, and then why India was really hesitant towards the developments of Quad, at least initially. What is the approach of the Ministry of External Affairs towards all these developments? So we have covered a lot of recent events that are right now happening as far as this Indo-Pacific is concerned. So I really liked it. I would like to request you, maybe during the question answer round, if you can just touch upon this aspect of pragmatic diplomacy. What do you think about it? The reason why I am asking you right here, because maybe later I will forget about it. So I thought that let me ask you right here. So I would really appreciate if you can touch upon the topic of pragmatic diplomacy and what do you think about it as far as India's foreign policy is concerned. So thank you, Roshali. The next speaker would be Abhishek Mishra. Abhishek is from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and
it's Abhishank.
Abhishank, I'm sorry, Abhishank. Abhishank is from Jawaharlal Nehru University. Abhishank is pursuing your PhD from which center, Abhishank?
South Asian Studies, ma'am.
South Asian Studies, okay. And your topic would be Asia Pacific Security Order, Regional Dynamics and Strategies of Mitigating Conflict.
Ma'am,
So,
this is not my PhD topic, but this is the title of the presentation that will be. Yeah.
Title of
Yes.
your presentation. Yes. Okay, so over to you, Abhishank.
Thank you so much, Sampa ma'am, for that very kind introduction. I think there's already been a lot that has been said about the region in itself, the dynamics particularly. So my paper anyways were a little more theoretical than based on empirical facts and figures in that sense. So I think it would be a good value addition to the conversation that is already happening about the region in itself. So coming to the presentation itself, the title of my presentation is Asia Pacific Security Order, Strategies of Mitigating Conflict. So in this paper, I would basically be looking at the current efficacy of certain regional organizations in mitigating conflict and potentially traditional security threats in the region. Apart from that, I would be looking at the prospects of pre-existing and future mechanisms to promote a stable and peaceful region. And at the same time, I would be looking at and analyzing the conflict patterns and nature of conflict in the region, along with the geopolitics and regional dynamics, to propose what would be a viable strategy to maintain peace or stability in the region itself. Now, I'll try to keep it very short and sweet because there's already been a lot that has been said. So coming to the theoretical context of it, I tried to situate the whole paper in itself in the Friedberg, Kang and Acharya debate on the stability of the region or the future of the region. I start off by talking about Friedberg, who talks about this whole notion of ripe for rivalry, as he sees the Asia Pacific region to being ripe for rivalry, as it has dynamics that were seen in Europe being replicated to a certain extent in terms of the arms and ammunitions and the general trend of increasing armament in the region itself. This is contradicted by Kang, who says in his article, which is very candidly, titled "Getting Asia Wrong" in 2003, he goes on to say that Asia or Asia Pacific in particular will be replicating trends that were centered around China to a certain extent. So he says that there will be a Chinese centrality and there will be a hierarchical order in the future in the Asia Pacific region in itself, right? So you've got two contradictory views developing in terms of Friedberg saying that the European dynamics will replicate itself, and Kang saying that Asia has its own, I mean, it's parochial and it's contextual, and this context needs to be taken into account to predict the future of the region in itself. Dives into this whole debate is Amitav Acharya in 2004, and he goes on to say that it will not be a China-centric order in the future, and he basically puts a lot of emphasis on regional institutions and institutional architectures to mitigate conflict in the region in the long term. But he also he takes the lead from Kang in the sense, and he says that the whole contextual and parochial nature of Asia needs to be taken into account, and we should not be, I mean, saying that European dynamics will replicate itself in the Asian context itself. So this is broadly the theoretical, the debate that was going on around the stability of the Asia Pacific region, and this is where I situate the paper in itself as well. Coming to the immediate context, and I'm sure a lot of other people already also must have talked about it. Particularly, I'll talk about 3 or 4 things that are important, I feel are important to the analysis that I'm making and the argument that I'm going to make. Is first of all, in the immediate context, we see the Trump presidency to a certain extent has been very transactional. That has put a lot of strain on the regional actors of the region, particularly Japan and South Korea. Then North Korean aggression and the North Korean nuclear program and their constant tests in the region in and around itself has been something that has been destabilizing as well, and has to a certain extent pushed the Japanese towards remilitarization. Those trends can be seen in terms of the accusations that they are making in terms of military, the F-35 jets and all of that. And the most dominant trend that has been talked about in this whole panel is the Chinese aggression in itself. So I don't think I need to substantiate what the Chinese aggression is all about. I think it's particularly clear in terms of the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the disputes that are there. There are other disputes as well, which I would be talking about, in the nature of disputes that we see in the region itself. Now, the theoretical framework that I use in this paper is the regional security complex theory by Barry Buzan and Olive Weaver. This is an important theory, and it provides a lot of it provides a good framework for explaining the security interdependencies in the region, and it's a good mix between the realist and the constructivist methodologies. So it provided a good framework for me to work with. In itself, not getting into the theory too much, but saying that I would be using, if you want, you can read the paper later on when it's published. It goes on to say that the region in itself is characterized as a super complex because there are more than one great powers involved. More than one meaning Japan is considered a great power here, US is considered a great power here, and China is considered a great power here. Even Russia, for that matter, can be characterized, but India, I would not particularly say that is a great power already. It's an emerging great power and is seeking a greater role in the Asia Pacific, and how well it's able to power project in the Asia Pacific will determine whether it's able to rise up to that great power stature to a certain extent. So in this theory, I end up looking at the internal transformation because it provides 3 modalities in which you can look at the dynamics of a region. And the first one is the status quo, which is the region remaining the same. Then there's the second possibility of an internal transformation, and there's a third possibility of an external transformation. So I would be looking at the internal transformation of the region, in which I would be suggesting regional mechanisms through which we can mitigate conflict in the region itself. Coming to the nature of disputes, as we all know, are particularly of 2 kinds. There are territorial disputes that we can see through competition between India and China, particularly in the Doklam and the Galwan Valley confrontation that we're seeing right now. Apart from that, we can see there are a number of disputes related to, EEZs in the region, along with control of blue water economy in the region itself. So these are 2 headers on which you can characterize the dominant trends or the dominant disputes that are happening. So it's territorial and it's maritime. So in maritime, we've got EEZ and we've got blue water economy, and in territorial, we've got strictly territory being encroached and all of that. So coming to the balance of power characterizations, and I heard a lot of my colleagues talking about evasive balancing, hedging, all of these different things. I particularly am working on trying to debunk this whole hedging, balancing, bandwagoning thesis to a certain extent. and I feel that it's very fluid and it's changed over time. So it's changed from balancing against China to hedging towards China and the US. And now, to a certain extent, we're talking about bandwagoning with the US. So these are some balance of power characterizations that we all know were present to a certain extent. Now, I think the biggest question here is, why is Chinese aggression or this aggressive China being resisted to a certain extent? What do countries see in this trend that they fear, right? So the prospect and the meaning of a China-centric regional order is daunting because of the hierarchical nature and the non-rule-based order that China, shows that it might end up being perpetuating if it becomes the hegemon of the region itself. So it's the hierarchical, non-rule-based projection of power that it's doing right now to create a hierarchical order that's not based on rules, but is rather based on might is right principles, is something that is particularly feared by a lot of countries, right? That is why countries are looking to either evade this whole order in itself through bandwagoning with the US, or trying to be part of it through bandwagoning with China. So they're seeing their own capabilities, and the cost and benefit analysis is at play, right? So coming to the theoretical analysis and strategies of mitigating conflict in itself, in this paper, I basically talk about there being 4 stabilizers that can be potentially used, which are already present or can be produced in the region to create a stable world order, Asia-Pacific order in the future. The first one of them is ASEAN centrality, and there are a number of appendages that are there in this ASEAN centrality argument, which is the ASEAN Regional Forum, there's the East Asian Summit, and there's the Asian Defense Ministers Meeting. So ADMM, ARF, and the East Asia Summit are 3 mechanisms through which, by creating, as I think one of the panelists talked about, multilateralizing the region with like-minded countries, and the vision being something that is, enmeshed to a certain extent, right? So these 3 mechanisms, these 3 regional forums can be used potently to create a minilateral alliance against China to a certain extent, not just militarily in the future, potentially if traditional security threats are faced, but diplomatically right now, right? But I would also like to say that there is a peripherality of the ASEAN, particularly right now, because of their lack of decisiveness against China. So they are not willing to antagonize China in itself. So that is something that needs to be worked on in the future. Apart from that, this is something that's novel. I try to say that the East Asian security community is something that could be particularly useful in the future. So a security community around East Asian powers could be something that could be useful for mitigating conflict in the future. And it would help in creating linkages and mechanisms along with the ARF to create regional cooperation. Apart from that, there is the Quad. I'm sure we all know what the Quad is. It's an informal security dialogue, which has now been transformed into something of, there's a lot of responsibility that is being projected on it in terms of what it can do in the future. And particularly one important development that can be, I can single out is Australia being allowed to be part of the Malabar exercise in itself. So that makes the Quad operational to a certain extent. So that is one big thing that could be a bulwark against Chinese aggression, this 4 democracies coming together against Chinese aggression. So Quad potentially can be not just a diplomatic, but a military, balance to the Chinese aggression that we see. Apart from that, the last suggestion that I make is of this collective security arrangement, which is the ANZUS, the Australia, New Zealand, United States Security Treaty. It's a collective security non-binding agreement between Australia, New Zealand, and Australia and United States to cooperate on matters of Pacific security. So we can see that there are incursions in the Southwest Pacific as well. So the Australians and the New Zealanders are particularly concerned about that. And I think this that reviving this whole ANZUS treaty, which we can see that it has particularly lasted over the years, but intensifying the cooperation within this whole forum would be something that could be a potential stabilizer in the region in the future. So trying to conclude from giving these 4 suggestions, which is particularly cooperation along those 4 lines, I would like to say that the future of the region, as has been theorized by these 3 gentlemen, Friedberg, Kang and Acharya, is uncertain. And it needs further theorization. Apart from that, I think American commitment to the region would be the key to the stability of the region in itself. And Indian power projection and partnership with Japan is going to be particularly important in stabilizing the region as well. I think the most important thing with the East Asian security community that I'm suggesting is that this whole security community would reaffirm the centrality of ASEAN, which is one of the biggest and the most central players in this whole Asia Pacific region in itself. So particularly if we end up strengthening this, I think we can end up providing stability to the region in the future. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishank. You have very appropriately touched upon the theoretical aspect of Indo-Pacific. I really liked you using the theory of regional security complex theory given by Barry Buzan, and you have seen the entire developments in the Indo-Pacific from the theoretical point of view, which is very important and necessary for the young scholars, because without analyzing and understanding the crux of the theories, sometimes it becomes little difficult to understand why something is happening, and why, if something is happening, then what would be the implication of that particular incident or event. I really liked your conclusion also, where you spoke about the East Asian security community, which is, I think, as you rightly said, promoted by ASEAN. But at the same time, ASEAN is also a little bit hesitant about this whole idea of alliance making or partnership making against China, because of course they are having their own own part of hesitation when it comes to uh, create a camp, sort of camp against China. But anyway, we'll have time to discuss about that later. So finally, I would like to request 2 of my former students from Symbiosis International University, Farida Chawla and Saurabh Singh, and you will be speaking about strengthening India-ASEAN relations, digital divide to digital diplomacy. So over to you. Both of you will be sharing the presentation, or?
Yes, ma'am. 4
Yes.
minutes each.
Okay, all right.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Hello and a very good evening to all, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank NIIC and Dr. Shampa Kundu for giving us the opportunity. About the topic, will take you a little away from China and like Abhishank said, centrality of ASEAN, because it's very important, a very major stakeholder in Indo-Pacific. So we'd like to talk about India-ASEAN relations and strengthening them through digital diplomacy. The paper majorly focuses on 3 areas, that is need for increasing digital diplomacy between India and ASEAN. Secondly, abridging the digital divide that exists. And finally, giving a few potential opportunities to strengthen digital cooperation in the region. We've chosen this topic because especially in the current era of COVID, digital diplomacy is a very instrumental tool, not only for diplomacy, but also for other domains like global governance, security, connectivity, and commerce. So moving on to the paper. Okay. As the title says, strengthening India-ASEAN relations, digital divide to digital diplomacy. The concept of digital diplomacy has been a focal point of interest in international relations lately. In the current pandemic-stricken conditions, where conventional diplomacy has taken a backseat due to the physical immobility, digital diplomacy has proved to be most instrumental channel
of interstate connectivity. Here, let us discuss the potential for digital cooperation between India and ASEAN. India-ASEAN cooperation is vital in the Indo-Pacific as it amounts to a population of 1.9 billion, with the fastest growing economies in production, commerce, and services. Their combined GDP amounts to $5.7 trillion.
Sorry for the interruption, Farida, but I am not able to see your presentation. I'm not really very sure if you have shared it.
So, as I was saying, India-ASEAN cooperation is vital in the Indo-Pacific, amounting to the large population and the increasing economy. Their combined GDP amounts to $5.7 trillion. India-ASEAN shares a vision of peace and prosperity and holds a very strategic geographic location, catering to the increasing inter-regional trade. Both India and ASEAN are emerging IT hubs in Asia with a massive potential for digitalization. However, the most prominent challenge to digital diplomacy is digital divide. Digital divide can be understood as discrepancy in availability and accessibility of digital resources and ICT services within a nation's demography or between two nations. The factors affecting the digital divide are resource disparity in rural and urban areas, lack of connectivity of international, of information and communication technology and services, disparity in social structures, democratic values, gender discrimination, and economic. These factors hinder the digital infrastructure of a nation. There is a prominent digital divide in the region. I'm sorry, as the presentation is not on, otherwise I'll just, yes. Okay, so if it's visible, here's a graph showing the ranking of ASEAN nations as well as India in 2019 in terms of digitalization. So only Singapore is a prominent player in digital infrastructure, which ranks second in Asia. Otherwise, there is a great divide among all other ASEAN nations, and even India is quite behind. The answer to enhanced cooperation and optimal advantage of soft power in increased connectivity between India and ASEAN is digital diplomacy. Digital diplomacy can be defined as the new realm in development of diplomatic relations. It aims at reaching to broader audiences through digital tools for a wider range of areas of cooperation and activities by exploring new opportunities performed in a global environment which is subject to continuous change and upgradation. Thus, digital diplomacy is hence the tool to bridge the gap of digital divide through digitalization of all critical domains of diplomacy, governance, security, commerce, and connectivity. The most important potential areas for digital cooperation in India and ASEAN will be further discussed by Saurav. Over to you, Saurav.
Yeah, thank you. These are the 6 parameters we have taken for bridging the India-ASEAN digital divide, and these are the 6, and we'll be discussing one by one. Is my screen visible? I have shared my PPT with the NIS team. Can they share it?
It was visible a minute ago, but right now it is not. Yeah, now it's fine.
Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Just a sec. Yeah, so the first is the India ASEAN Submarine Optical Fiber Cable Initiative. And the salient features of this initiative can be uh, it promises 5G connectivity, and it also plays an alternative to the Chinese and the Western domination for the OFC cables. India has already hold a $1 billion line of credit to the ASEAN countries, and through the protected ring of digital highway network architecture from the northeast, we can have the intra-island connectivity among the ASEAN nations. And another feature is that it will have a stronger connect between the northeast India states and the Southeast Asian countries. The next is enhancing e-commerce in the banking facility. Now, the business to consumer market is one of the fastest growing channel in two economies. And in order to further boost the digital trade, India and ASEAN can sign a MOU between ASEAN central banks and the National Payment Corporation of India. Now, India and Singapore are already living a step ahead, and they have already signed a MOU between the two, and the digital trade is enhancing since then. Other two thing is that this will also help in the growth of small industries and medium industries, like for example women help self group, artisans and painters, such as other small industries. Other thing is that it will also help in flourishing the tourism and travel industries. Third is the India ASEAN Cybersecurity Cooperation and the data governance localization policy. So these were two different topics. I have combined them too now because they go in hand in hand. So we can have an integrated data localization between ASEAN and the Indian country, between the two economies. We can have increased R&D in the cyber domain and ITC. We can establish a multi-stakeholder dialogue between various business houses, cybersecurity service providers, law enforcement agencies, academia, and other. They can form a coalition to monitor the current trends in the cybercrime in the Indo-Pacific region, and mainly the Chinese aggression there with the digital domain. And we can have an information exchange mechanism between the law enforcement agencies of the two economies so that we have better cooperation. A need-based information sharing and exchange channel can be formed. And these all the steps, as well as the data localization policy, will help the two economies in becoming the two big data giants. Now, the Smart Sister Cities Network, the Good Governance Initiative, is really an important step between India and ASEAN cooperation. So we can have people-to-people connect. This initiative will help us step towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goal. Through the transfer of technologies, we can have an integrated schools and classroom program. It will definitely enhance the standard of living because pollution-free cities and everything will be on the digital space. It will have the better opportunities and supply chain resilience system between the two economies so that we don't have to depend on another country, or like for example in COVID, a lot of supply chain got stuck. The e-governance services will definitely boost up because it will be on the digital domain. And the last thing, the Smart Sister Cities Network will definitely help creating a responsible global citizen. Finally, the last thing is the Global Coalition Disaster Resilient Infrastructure System, and it is proposed by India during the last year 2019 UN Climate Summit, and it was proposed by India there. So basically, it's a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure. It will act as a convincing body to pool different materials, to pool different convincing body to pool different practices and resources around the world for reshaping construction, transportation, energy, and telecommunication services. It will help upgrading the disaster management infrastructure. It will bridge the gap of funds and technologies. It will, since India and ASEAN shares so much past experience and past knowledge with handling disasters and mitigating them, so definitely the two can play a critical role in that. Finally, I like to conclude that digitization is to the Asian century what industrialization was to the European century. Digitization will definitely help in mobilizing the population towards innovation and newer possibilities, and hence accelerating development. So abridging the digital divide and enhancing the digital diplomacy will definitely have a prosperous and progressive India-ASEAN relations. That's it, and thank you, Fanice, again, and thank you, ma'am, for such an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Saurav and Farida. It was a very good and unique presentation in the sense that you have really touched upon some of the technical issues when it comes to digital diplomacy and you have appropriately identified if there is any digital divide, then where it is exactly. So that was a very good presentation. So I think that was our last presentation for this panel, and we now have around 20 minutes for a question answer round. So as a chair, as a moderator of the session, I would like to take the opportunity first to, ask some of you questions that were coming to my mind when I was hearing all of you. So firstly, congratulations to all of you for the excellent presentations. We have heard about Australia's participation in the Indo-Pacific in this panel quite a lot. I think 3 presentations were there that actually touched upon the perception from Australia and why Australia is important for the Indo-Pacific region. But I couldn't hear anything about Japan and what is Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific, because it is Japan's leader, Japan's outgoing Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who first spoke about the free Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So I would like to request you, Rushali or Abhishank or Dipankar, or maybe Siddhant also can contribute and see what is Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region, and what importance Japan carries for this entire Indo-Pacific vision as far as India's foreign policy is also concerned. Um, and the second question that I'm having for the panel is particularly for Abhishank. Abhishank, you spoke about a kind of conglomeration between East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, as well as ADMM Plus, right? If I'm not wrong. So, what sort of future do you foresee for this kind of, combination of these 3 different regional architectures that we have in the region? So what exactly is in your mind when you are recommending such a conglomeration or such a combination between these 3 organizations or these 3 institutions? So that is my question for you. I have another question, maybe Siddhant or Rushali or anyone who is interested in Australia can answer that, and that is, what role can minilateralism play? Because we are hearing a lot about the broader Indo-Pacific canvas and the broader Indo-Pacific approach, but we also know that Russia, India, China forum is there. Also Japan, India and Australia forum is there. So what role do you think these minilateral initiatives can also play, and are they here to enhance the regional integration in the Indo-Pacific, or these are only few other talking shops? So I would like to have your take on that as well. Yeah, that's it, I think, as of now. So let me first hear your responses on this, and then I can have other questions. I can't see any questions in the chat box, so if any participant has any question for any of the panelists or co-panelists, please type it in the chat box so that I can have those questions for you. So anyone can start. I think Abhishank or Rushali, if you can start.
I would request Ushali to go first.
Okay.
Before I address these questions which you just raised, I'd like to go back to the question which you raised previously after my presentation about pragmatism. I think all of us here will agree that the term pragmatism itself in international relations is quite a slippery slope. It doesn't have well-defined boundaries, so to speak, and mostly it has been used in context of the American foreign policy, and it's so I believe that when we're talking about pragmatism in Indian foreign policy, we can get lost because many feel that Nehru's non-alignment was not pragmatic. But I don't subscribe to that view, because I think it was well suited to the international politics of the time. Given the Cold War bipolarity, it was the best option for a small country which had just received independence to keep itself away from superpower rivalries. So according to me, if we look at a very broad definition of pragmatic in terms of being rational or suited to the national interest, I think it was pragmatic. So, but I'm glad that question came up in context of the Indo-Pacific region, which is the question which I tried to raise: is balancing a pragmatic strategy in this context, which I believe it was until Chinese revisionist agendas, if I may say so. I know it's a very strong and loaded term, but I believe that its recent aggressiveness, it's being extremely vocal about how it wants a global order which is more suited to its own interest, speaking out against Western liberal ideas, criticizing the concept of human rights. All of these, I believe, is sort of confirming that China does want to revise at least certain aspects of the global order. So there's definitely aggression, and it's more ambitious than ever before. So in that context, I believe, in tune with the whole idea that pragmatism itself is a very fluid, changing, evolutionary concept, I believe we need to injunct more pragmatism into our Indo-Pacific strategy, which is what I tried to address briefly in my presentation. So I hope that answers your question. And with regard to Japan, ma'am, I think that's a very, very relevant question, of course, which you've raised, because ultimately it was Prime Minister Shinzo Abe who did bring the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific into the highlight. And I believe that his, like the end of his tenure will have a huge impact on how the geopolitics of the region will play out. And Japan, I think, is a very, very crucial player, because if you look at the bilateral equations which are there, whether it is in terms of with the United States on one hand, on the other hand, it also ascribes to the notion of ASEAN centrality, especially for a country like India. I believe our interests with Japan are very well suited in constructing an order which is more suitable to both mutual interests. It is, to say, a win-win cooperation, given the shared values. And especially even when it comes to Japan, I think our trajectory with relations, like the relations which we had with China, the trajectory of that relation is quite similar with that of what Japan and China has. Like, you cannot describe China as an enemy or as a friend in like neat terms for when we're talking about bilateral relations, whether we look at with India, whether we look at with Japan. So in that sense, Japan is a very crucial player, and I think Japan will continue to hold a very central role in the Indo-Pacific region, and it is in India's interest to enhance its partnerships with Japan, which is also, if we notice a trend that Japan is also being more aggressive. It has sort of let go of its earlier isolationist, where it was subdued. Now it knows that it has the economic power, it has a say. So I see a convergence of interests in that sense. So I believe that a partnership is in the making and will only grow stronger. As far as the Australian question is concerned, I think the multilateralism sort of which is emerging, or minilateralism rather, these terms are itself so muddled in the literature, but I'd say institutions, if I may use the term, which are emerging in the region are good for the prospects of Indo-Pacific, because on one hand, it sends the message out to Chinese that alone you cannot have your hegemonic ambitions in the region. That it's not just one, as I mentioned in my presentation, that it is not only a problem for India if China is included in this inclusive construct. It is a threat to all the countries in the region. And I think that these forums are to send out that message to China more strongly than ever, that you cannot get away with your hegemonic ambitions. But again, having said that, of course, the very Indian hesitance to include Australia in the Malabar exercise, although relations are at peak and Australia is, I think, more open towards India than it has ever been in the past, despite convergence of interest. These are the things which I think are, of course, hesitations, which I think are hesitations of history, if I can use that term, or traditional hesitations, which is something which I think the Indian strategic circles, policy experts need to rethink, to send out a message that the collective partnerships are the basis of the rules-based order in the region. So overall, I think the forums which are emerging send out that message that it is in fact a rules-based order. It is not about US dominance, it is not about Indian dominance, but in fact, as Abhishek had pointed out, it's about ASEAN centrality. So I hope those answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Rushali. Yes, Abhishek.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Charlie, for that. I think I would like to, first of all, ma'am, I have there is a private message that has been sent by somebody, which would be complementary to the question that you've asked about the mechanisms in the ASEAN. I'll read out the question so that everybody knows what it's about.
Okay.
It says ambiguity has always been, this is Nitin Sharma. He goes on to say ambiguity has always been a restraint to the formation of a bandwagon. You talked about ASEAN centrality in the region, but given the recent trend in diverging interest in the ASEAN, the Philippines get closer to China after Rodrigo Duterte. How can we expect a centrality in the region plus Japan and South Korea tensions? There are various issues to counter to really manifest a global community. How do you see to what extent this COVID pandemic will nudge the East Asian players to form a coalition against China? First of all, I would like to address and clarify what I was trying to say. When I mentioned ADMM, ARF, and East Asian Summit, I was not saying that all of the three can be clubbed together and used. I am saying that exclusively all of these three things can be used together as a mechanism. All of these three exclusively can be used together as a mechanism to build a certain amount of. So I think what is important for me to stress at this point is that there would be a certain desecuritization of intra-ASEAN issues. That is what I'm trying to talk about. In these forums, desecuritization of intra-ASEAN issues and to a certain extent politicization and securitization against China to a certain extent. Now what Nitin is basically trying to say here is that it's a long shot, that ASEAN centrality and all the ASEAN intra-ASEAN players to come together is a long shot, and I agree with that, right? But I think when he goes on to mention in the latter part of the question that how can you see COVID pandemic bringing countries together? I feel that there are certain global concerns that are there. Climate change is one of them. Now, this pandemic has shown that global health is something that needs to be prioritized and securitized in the non-traditional sense to a greater extent as well. So if we end up looking at global concerns and the concern towards global commons, those issues can be lead to other issue linkages for further cooperation between the players in itself. In itself, I know there are a lot of impediments in the ASEAN centrality and intra-ASEAN players coming together. There are things like technocratic depoliticization, and there would be a need for cultural exchange, increased cultural exchange for it to happen. But I feel that increasingly, even though also economically, I must point out that economically, the production networks that are there in the ASEAN that are commissioned, were earlier commissioned by Japan and now are commissioned by China, are going to be another impediment. But at the same time, if you look at the history of this region, which is a history of colonization, territorial sovereignty and other territory related issues are prioritized and are of uncompromising nature in these countries itself. So that tendency, along with these common concerns of global health, or for that matter, climate change, because climate change again is another destabilizer in the sense that a lot of island nations are there in the ASEAN. So if the sea levels rise, that is the most imminent security threat that they are going to face, and traditional security threats can take a backseat. So I feel that there is more that they can cooperate on than to not cooperate on. I think there is more that they can link on and build upon than to not. And all of this is a long shot. This is all about the future, and all of this is hypothesization to a certain extent. That is the point of this paper, to look at strategies of mitigating the conflict. And these are some of the strategies that I go on to talk about. And in terms of Japan, I think, as Rushali pointed out very clearly, that I think the relationship between US, India, and Japan, this trilateral relationship is going to determine the future of this region, because these are three very important stakeholders of the region itself. So I feel, and we can see signs of India-Japan relationship going from strength to strength in terms of the investments that they're making from the bullet train, that the bullet train project has been commissioned to them. There are a lot of other projects in the Northeast related to road building and all of that, which have also been given to Japan. So we can already see there's no economic hesitancy between India and Japan, which is there between India and China. So I think we can already see that there is a certain amount of confidence that India has on Japan. right? And I think Shinzo Abe going away, abdicating to a certain extent because of his health concerns, is a huge dent to the public diplomacy between Modi and Shinzo Abe. The palpable aesthetic of cooperation that we used to see is something that's going to be missing, but let's see who the next person is. So I wouldn't say particularly, but I also think that the Japanese are trying to cooperate with us because of the lack of, or the ambiguity of, American commitment to the region itself. So they see India as a stable partner because the geo-proximity of India and Japan in the region to China, vis-a-vis China, is something that makes us more that India and Japan is going to be a relationship that will foster in the future. We can already see signs in the economic sphere, and I think as well as the military sphere in the Malabar exercise. But this is all circumspect because of the next leader that comes. So we can see that whenever leadership changes, there is something that is going to discontinue. So there will be a little time that we need to give to this relationship for it to foster completely. But I think the fundamentals of the relationship in itself are very strong.
Okay, thank you, Abhishank. I just have one quick question for Dipankar and Abhoday. Since both of you spoke about the middle powers, so I would like to know from both of you, or any one of you can respond to the question. What do you think? What would be the possible scenario if countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, or Singapore, countries, these countries do have their robust economic cooperation both with China and also with India, and then they also have very good economic relationships with Australia and of course with America. So how do you think what would be the role of these countries, since you spoke about middle powers? So countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and also Vietnam. Vietnam is again very important country in the region. What role you foresee for these countries in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First, answering Abhishank's question, I think most probably it would be Yoshihide Suga, who would be heading the Japanese parliament. But still, the middle powers, they are a very heterogeneous. They are very heterogeneous in their definition. Every power is very different from the other, but we use the term middle power because it is easier for us to define them as. But the problem is, like, if we take the concept of middle power theorization, which I mentioned, and if we use it in geopolitical and securitization terms in the ASEAN, taking Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam as examples, and Singapore as well, we see that because of the current COVID-19 pandemic, the trend which was the trend of Western powers, the West being a big exporter and a trade partner of ASEAN, it was being subsumed by China. But after this COVID-19 pandemic, it has catapulted. The dependence of ASEAN towards China has increased much more, because we can see the only country with positive GDP numbers is China right now. And they are becoming a bigger partner of ASEAN, given the fact that other countries are not able to provide that kind of trade relations currently. So whatever their strategic interests are, they cannot just do away with their economic interests in respect to China. So they have to, it is a very, very difficult balance that they have to manage while looking after their security concerns and sovereignty, as well as managing their economic relations with China. Many of Vietnamese diplomats are told before their first duties in China that the Vietnamese leader is of no use if he cannot have a tough stand against the Chinese in security realm and a cooperative stand in economic realm. So they have to manage both things. Yeah, it is a very difficult balance, but taking the Quad into consideration and the smaller plurilateral organizations or plurilateral what Jaishankar has mentioned, plurilateral organizations which are coming into consideration, like India, Australia, and India, Australian, France trilateral, and other trilaterals, India, Australian, Indonesia trilateral. These can play a big role in managing the security aspects as well as uh, taking care of the sovereignty concerns of these middle powers.
Thank you, Abhoday. I just have another question for the last presentation. And, with that, actually, I'm going to shift the discussion from the Indo-Pacific, from the broader canvas of Indo-Pacific to South Asia. And the question is, you spoke about the digital divide and digital diplomacy and what India can learn from ASEAN, right? So from India, I would also like to ask you, apart from India, the other countries in the South Asian region, if we take into consideration their interest in digital diplomacy and having a crack into this digital divide, what do you think SAARC and BIMSTEC can learn from ASEAN in terms of digitization and in terms of enhancement of their technical capabilities? So what is your take on this? Sorry, this question is for Farida and Saurav.
Yeah. No, thank you. SAARC and BIMSTEC can learn a lot from the Digital Divide Initiative, especially like, for example, SAARC has its own problems as such. First of all, the India-Pakistan ties. So that needs to be resolved first, then only we can move to the digital part, because that's a lot of hindrance, because we saw that SAARC wanted to launch a satellite for the SAARC satellite, but somehow Pakistan had some issues with it. So the project somehow got derailed. And talking about the BIMSTEC part, yeah, BIMSTEC can definitely learn a lot from the digital divide and the digital diplomacy. For example, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, as well as Myanmar and Thailand, we can learn a lot. And new projects can be incorporated in that. And we can have, again, the data localization policy, like we mentioned in the presentation. And we can have a mechanism for the payment system as well. And these are the very small initiatives, but definitely we can have a go with that. And there's a lot of scope in the development. Anything Farida like to add?
Yes, so about BIMSTEC, there's huge potential, and it can also counter the BRI, China's BRI, as China has already started working on building digital roads, right? Even in the CPEC, it is digitalizing. So to counter that, I think digitalization can be introduced in BIMSTEC connectivity as well. And one of the main pioneer in that could be the optical fiber network that Saurav talked about. So yes, introducing digitalization could enhance and speed up the process of connectivity throughout BIMSTEC. So
And
that
last
would be an
thing I want to add is that, for example, the Asian Century, we talked about Asian Century. So all the regional organizations, I think definitely they should think about it and take it as a collaborative project rather than distinctive one. So for example, what industrialization was for the European century, definitely the digitalization can be for the Asian century. And we have a lot of scope in that. For example, Singapore, Japan, India, they are the developing economies in the region. So definitely we can have a well-established. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Personally, this panel was really very dear and near to my heart, because all the panelists, all the speakers in this panel are somehow related to either to my alma maters or to the organizations where I have been either working or I have worked. So I am a student of Calcutta University and then JNU, and then Symbiosis and Amity are the places where I have worked and have been working with Amity. So thank you to all of you. I think in this panel we have covered a lot of aspects, starting from India's non-aligned movement to strategic autonomy, to India's foreign policy broad objectives, to Indo-Pacific, to Australia, to digital diplomacy, and women leaders, to name a few. So once again, thank you to all of you, and my Heartfelt thanks to the NICE team for wonderfully organizing this panel. I think we can now conclude the session. Rafia, over to you.
Yeah. Distinguished speakers, chairs, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the 18th session. It is my honor to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of NICE to all who have graced us with their presence and contributed their parts to make this event a resounding success. First of all, we would like to express our profuse gratitude and sincere thanks to Dr. Shampa Kundu for agreeing to this session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to our all speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such a comprehensive and convincing presentation. We are really honored to have all the speakers with us here today. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live on our YouTube channel. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making the session productive with your questions. We are truly honored to have you all with us in this evening and hope to stay connected with you in future as well. It's really been a pleasure. Also do join at our next session. Thank you so much.